Hi, Carolyn. It's such an honor to be here to talk to you about your Nobel Prize and also your career in life science. And my name is Sofia Iskrak. I'm a third-year bachelor student at Karolinska Institutet, where I'm studying biomedicine.
Wonderful. Thank you for having me here.
Yes. So I want to start with a question that probably you've heard a lot, but what did inspire you to do science?
That's a good question. I grew up in a science family with a father who was a physics professor at MIT in Cambridge, USA. And I had a household full of gadgets and science objects and computers and things like that. And I was okay in my science classes, but I didn't really commit to a life in science until I was probably in my second year of college.
So were you a good student, both in high school and at the university, at college?
Yes, I was a pretty good student in high school. Not like the best of the best, but solid in a lot of different subjects. And I played sports, and I played in music groups.
Yeah,
so
I've
I did a
heard.
lot of different things. Yeah, I wasn't like entirely like school and class oriented, but I worked hard enough to do well.
Did you have any other favorite subjects apart from science, which wasn't your favorite subject apparently?
Well, I liked some science classes I really did like as a kid. I liked biology. That was one that I found really interesting. To be honest, my chemistry experiences before college were not so great, and so I didn't really give much thought to chemistry. I didn't hate chemistry, but I wouldn't say that I thought about it as a potential career. But no, I would say my focus before college was more on sports and music, if anything.
Interesting. And then you started studying biology as your undergrad program to become a pre-med, or?
Exactly.
Okay.
That's right. So I went to Harvard University, and in my freshman year, I signed up for the classes that you would take if you're preparing for medical school. And I declared myself a biology major, and then I was on that track. And then in my second year of college is when I took organic chemistry because it was a requirement for the pre-med, not because I wanted to take it, but because I had to take it. But then, to my surprise, I really had an affinity for the subject, and I really enjoyed it, and I was thinking about it all the time. So by the end of my second year of college, I had made the decision to switch my major to chemistry and to be an organic chemist.
Interesting. So was your career clear to you after that point? Did you know always that you're going to stick with chemistry?
I wouldn't say that I really gave any thought to my career as an adult, really. I was more living in the moment. I really enjoyed organic chemistry, and I was reading books from the library, and I loved to solve the problems, and I was looking for a research opportunity. But if somebody had asked me back then what my career might look like, on a longer timeline, I don't think I would have been able to, predict. I didn't really have much of a long-term thought.
So when the time came to choose your PhD project, was it easy? Did you know what you wanted to do?
Well, I knew I wanted to do organic synthesis. And in my head, I thought if I could do chemistry where there's applications in biology, that might be even more interesting. And so I joined the lab of a brand new assistant professor at UC Berkeley. This is now in 1988. And he had basically an interest in synthesis of carbohydrate analogs, where the carbohydrate analogs could be used as tools to study glycobiology. And I had never heard of glycobiology, and I didn't know anything about sugars or any of that. So it was all very foreign to me, but he was very enthusiastic, and he made it sound very exciting. And the idea of being among the first graduate students to join a brand new lab and get the lab off the ground from scratch was really exciting as a concept. So there were many things that drew me to that research area, but it wasn't just the science of the project. It was also to work with this person and to work in a lab that's brand new, and there were other factors involved.
So did your career turn out everything you expected it to be, or not career, but work in academia and research?
Well, I don't know that I had expectations, to be honest. When I applied for jobs, at that point I was a postdoctoral fellow in an immunology lab at the UC San Francisco Medical School. So I had left chemistry to do this postdoctoral fellowship in a totally different area. And I hadn't really given a whole lot of thought to my long-term career ideas. I was really, again, thinking very short-term, like this is what I'm interested in right now, and I want to learn more about this, and learn some immunology skills and use the chemistry skills in this immunology lab. And so I really was not a very good long-term planner or thinker. And I applied for academic jobs really on the encouragement of a friend of mine who was at Stanford as a professor. And I had known him since my undergraduate days because I had done an internship at a place called Bell Labs in the United States, working in the area of physical chemistry. And I knew, and so we were friends and we kept in touch, and he encouraged me to apply for a faculty opening at Stanford. And then I thought, well, I guess I have nothing to lose, why not? It was sort of on a whim almost, And then I started organizing my application, and I needed some letters of recommendation. So I went back to Berkeley to my professors there where I had been a PhD student, and I told them I'm applying for this job, and they said, well, we have a job too. Maybe you should also apply to our job, right? And then it happened again at UC San Francisco. They had a job, and so I applied to those 3 jobs, all in the Bay Area, and I ended up getting an offer from Berkeley to become an assistant professor there. And that was really the first time that I took a step back and asked myself, do I want this job? I had applied for these jobs without really thinking, is this the career path I really want? Will I be happy in this job? And I had to really think it through.
So how old were you at that point?
28 or so, yeah.
It
worked out.
Yeah, I see
right?
that.
I mean, I think nobody would dispute that now. But in that moment, I was very uncertain as to whether becoming a professor was a good idea for me, whether I would be happy and fulfilled, and how I would do the job, and I didn't really have.
So what was your thought process there? What were the things that you considered when agreeing to that job?
Well, there was no question that it was a great opportunity. Yeah. So that was clear, a huge opportunity. And I felt like I should give it a go. If someone puts an opportunity before you, you feel like, okay, you don't want to turn it down. I mean, you'll be regretful probably.
That's how I ended up here.
You did? Yeah. This is an opportunity too. But I remember having a conversation with my father, who is a professor, right? He's retired now, but he was a professor at MIT. And I said to him, I'm really not sure if this is really what I want to do. I didn't have a whole lot of confidence. I had ideas and I had research projects that I wanted to pursue. So that wasn't the problem. The problem was just I didn't really have a lot of confidence in my ability to sort of survive in academia. Academia back then wasn't all that friendly to women. And I pictured myself in a department, with 4 women out of 75 faculty. And, I pictured myself trying to get grants funded and trying to get papers published and trying to mentor students. And, I had some fear about whether I could handle all of that with all the pressures of being in a minority situation. And I talked to my dad about it. And I remember he said, you need to have a job. You need to have some job, right? And this is a good job offer. It's a good opportunity. So why not try it? And if you don't like it, you can always move on and do other things later. But, give it a try for a few years and see what happens.
Well, great that you did take it. And
yes. Well, now I'm very glad. But it took me a couple of years, honestly, to feel like I had made the right decision. Things were a bit rough for me for the first 2 years.
Yeah, so what were the most challenging parts of?
Well, it was a new job, which I had no skills at, and no experience doing. And the transition from being a postdoctoral fellow or a graduate student to becoming a professor or a lab PI, the head of the lab, that's a big transition. And the things I was good at that gave me success as a graduate student and a postdoctoral fellow were not really relevant to what you need to be good at to be a professor and to run a lab. And so I had to learn on the job all the skills that you need, like the mentorship skills, the skills to raise money to support your research, the skills to communicate your work and compel people to invest in your lab and compel people to join your lab. And it just took me a few years to, make all the mistakes that you have to make and then get better at the job.
What was the most difficult skill to learn?
That's a good question. I think being able to mentor each student or trainee in my lab as an individual was something that it took some time to learn. When I started out, I made the classic rookie mistake that professors make, which is to assume that the trainees that join your lab have the same priorities and the same interests as you do. And of course they don't, because they're not clones of you, they're individuals. So, I interacted with my young students as if they should read my mind, right? As if they should know exactly what to do as I would do it. And of course, they were individuals who had their own interests and their own minds and their own personalities. And it took me a few years to kind of back off and get to know people as individuals and tailor the project and tailor my interaction style so that it worked well for them and it wasn't just coming from me alone.
So which values do you look in your mentees and students? What do you want them to be at the starting point?
Well, all I really care about when they start in my lab is that they're motivated, curious, committed, and that they have some basic skills in, how to think about experiments and how to design experiments. Of course, there's a lot to learn still, but just having that kind of basic foundation in what it means to do an experiment and what the scientific method means, right? And just an understanding of what you're trying to accomplish as a graduate student, which is to learn new knowledge and to give it to the world, right? If they have that sort of fundamental commitment, understanding, and they're serious about learning, nothing else really matters. It doesn't matter whether they had a lot of training in biology or chemistry or whether they came from a different field and they're transitioning into something new. They will catch up quickly, regardless of their background. It's more to do with the commitment and the seriousness, and just having the dedication to the research.
How do you teach your students to deal with mistakes and failed experiments? I know there can be a lot of frustration with nothing's working and you're feeling stuck. So how do you deal with that yourself, and what do you teach your students?
I experienced plenty of frustration as a graduate student and a postdoc. And I think first and foremost is to teach students what it means to do a good experiment. Like, what does a good experiment look like? And what are the controls? And a good experiment is one in which you know what question you're asking. You set up controls to eliminate unwanted outcomes, and so that you can interpret the data, in a meaningful way. And then the experimentalist has to be careful, and they have to document everything, and they have to think about safety, and they have to think about their data analytics. And if everything is well thought out and the experiment is well executed, then I really feel like there's no such thing as failure. There might be an outcome you didn't anticipate, right? There might be an outcome that is disappointing because maybe your hypothesis was incorrect. And you just have to follow the data, and you have to learn from the data, and you might be surprised. But if you did a good experiment so that you learn something from it, it's not a failure. It's just new knowledge that might prompt you to change your hypothesis.
Do you have a strategy to revisit your hypothesis, and how do you go back from the results that you haven't expected to see, and how do you teach your students where to look next?
Well, fortunately, I think the students I've had have pretty good instincts about that. But there have been circumstances where, we had a hypothesis, the experiments were well done, and we were wrong. Okay, that means you have to sit back and think about, what do you do next? Sometimes you come up with the next hypothesis and try that, and you're really exploring and trying to find the truth. Graduate students are on a clock. They can't work forever trying to understand the truth of a particular system. And so there are some strategic decisions that you have to make, which are sometimes disappointing. And once in a while, it might happen that a student is working, trying to get clarity on a system or trying to invent something or make a molecule. And years go by and they're just not getting there. And maybe if they had 10 years, they could get there, or 15 years or 20 years, they could get there. So it's not that you've lost confidence in their ability to get there. It's just the reality is they need to finish their PhD thesis in 5 or 6 years. So there are times where we will sit down and kind of take a high-level view of what's been going on in a frustrating project, and we might terminate the project. And then it's incumbent on me to put forth a proposal for another project, which I think has a higher probability of leading to a story that is publishable within a shorter period of time. So that's my job in the lab, is to make sure that everybody has a project that will produce enough interpretable results so that they can publish papers, tell a good story, apply for jobs, and get employment. I mean, there's a very pragmatic issues sometimes at stake.
Speaking of PhD students, I've met lots of overworked ones. Do you manage to keep your work-life balance, and do you teach your students and mentees how to do that and how to clear their heads and relax and get that time off research?
Yes, I do talk to my students about the importance of balance. I'm not sure that I am a good role model for this, so I talk about it. I don't necessarily live it that well because I have a tendency to overcommit myself, and then I end up with long nights and trying to meet deadlines that I wished I hadn't agreed to, but I did. And, but what I do with my lab is every year I give group meeting to my group in the first group meeting of the year, like the first week of January. And every year I give a very similar presentation. So some of my students have heard this now 5 times, okay? But I think you can't really hear it too much. And in this group meeting, I talk about many different things that I think are important to be a successful researcher. I talk about lab safety. I talk about doing good experiments, as we just discussed. I talk about being honest with your data even when it frustrates you, and the importance of integrity and to behave with the highest standards of ethics. And I also talk about figuring out how to manage their time efficiently so that they can be productive at work and be happy in their life outside of work. Some of my coworkers have families, they have children, and there's obligations with their children, and I understand that. And regardless of whether they have a family, I think everybody needs time where they're exercising, right? That's very important. They need time when they're exploring other creative activities, whether it's music on the side, right? Or some of them they have hobbies, and some of them are interested in art, and some of them actually do improv comedy. They like to go to these improv nights at comedy houses in the city, and it is important that they don't sacrifice all of those interests, because otherwise they'll be very unhappy and they won't be creative, and they eventually won't be productive either.
How does your work schedule look?
Well, it's changed a lot during COVID,
Yeah.
I think, is the funny thing. But looking back before COVID, I have 3 children, and so I understand, the demands on your schedule when you have kids that have to get to school, they have to get picked up, they have to work on homework, they have a lot of activities on the weekends and so on. And so that was a big part of my life. During COVID, of course, a lot of that stopped, and for a year and a half, they were going to school out of the house, on Zoom. So that was pretty disruptive for all of our schedules. Now, things have mostly returned back to the old days, but there's still more work from home and Zoom meetings from home than there used to be. So a typical day for me might have kind of a combination of doing meetings on Zoom, and we do these meetings on Zoom for convenience because there's people in different buildings, different around campus and off-sites and so on. And it's now, more convenient to do that on Zoom. But then I also am spending another part of the day in my office, and so it's a hybrid. But I'm teaching now in person again, so we don't teach on Zoom anymore. So I lecture, 3 days a week to undergraduates.
What about articles? I know that there are thousands of articles out there, and as a good researcher, you need to keep up. Do you have a strategy for that? Which
That's
ones
really
do you
hard.
read?
Okay, I have a strategy, but I don't know that it's the best, most effective strategy. The literature is overwhelming, especially if you work at, in an interdisciplinary area, because there's lots of different fields you need to keep up with. And so I need to keep up with the literature in chemistry, in chemical biology, in biology, and immunology, and cancer biology, glycobiology. And then I like to read things that are outside of the research areas of my lab, just so I can be fresh and informed. So I have tried over the years a number of different strategies. The one that has worked best for me, and I hate to say it, is Twitter.
Okay.
So I follow a number of journals on Twitter, and journals generally have a Twitter feed where each paper comes out as a tweet, and they cycle these tweets. So if you're following on Twitter, you can see quickly a lot of recent papers from the different journals that are coming into your feed. Now, a lot of the people I follow on Twitter who are scientists, they are reading similar journals because they're scientists with overlapping interest. So if I miss a paper from the journal's Twitter feed, someone else that I follow will probably retweet it and I'll see it. So there's so many people following related journals that I have found that eventually I will see it on Twitter. And Twitter has been more effective for me to scan the literature regularly than any other medium. And I've tried quite a few.
Then
but it's not perfect.
Yeah.
But
it's something, because
it's
it can be definitely overwhelming, especially if you start working on something new. You're like,
right.
Where do I start?
I did a better job at this when I was a student and a postdoc because I had more time. Now my time is very compressed because I have a lot of obligations, not just running the lab, but also I'm an institute director and I run a graduate program. So I have other administrative duties. I just don't have the time I used to have.
What about popular science? Do you read any of the recent books, and would you recommend anything for people who might be inspired to do science after this talk or just in general?
I do, from time to time, read science-oriented popular books. And there are a few that I would recommend, absolutely.
Which ones?
So there's different genres of books that I enjoy. I really like books that are focused around like an interesting topic that's both scientific but of just like human interest. So for example, I'm a big fan of Mary Roach. She's an author. She lives in San Francisco. And the first book I read that she wrote was a book called Stiff. And it's a book about what happens to the human body when we die. And it's actually scientifically fascinating. Yeah, it's the kind of subject where it might start with a morbid curiosity, right? But it's just a really interesting book, and she talks about the physiology of decomposition, as well as like the social science of how people treat death and how people study death, all the way from medical doctors and forensic scientists to the FBI, where they have to investigate a homicide and they need to figure out how long has the body been deceased, and there's a scientific approach to that. So that's an example of a book that I recommend.
Any chemistry related books?
Chemistry related books, there's a book called Aether Day, which is a book about the history of anesthesia, and that's a chemistry story, but there's a lot of interesting human personalities behind that evolution, as there are always. And so I learned a lot about the history of anesthesia, how it basically came to be practiced in the medical profession. And what's interesting is it started with dentistry. And back, in the 1700s and 1800s, the medical professions were much more primitive. And you know how there's a hierarchy in medicine where today surgeons consider themselves to be at the top of this hierarchy, at least in the U.S. I don't know if it's the same in Sweden.
Perhaps. Not
a
a
surgeon,
medical field, but...
Okay, well, a surgeon in the U.S. has a very prestigious position within the medical professions. But before anesthesia, that was not the case, because surgery was barbaric without anesthesia, and nobody would want to do such a thing, right? It's horrific. So dentistry used to be a much more prestigious, more refined, more elegant component of the medical professions. And the dentists are the ones that actually first brought anesthesia, into the medical practice and used it, right, to do procedures in the mouth. And then, of course, it became more widely used. And then surgery became a more refined practice. So I recommend that book, too. It's called Aether Day.
Wonderful. Both of them are going on my list.
Okay.
And I would like to thank you for this talk. It was a real pleasure, and I hope perhaps to meet you sometime in the future.
That would be great.
Proceeding in my career.
Come and postdoc in the United States, when you're done with your PhD.
It would be wonderful.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you.